A Secret Service agent knocks on your door. They say they hate your politics, and they forcibly drag you out of your house. They drag you into the middle of nowhere, upon which you see a massive tower. They throw you inside and use some MK Ultra type magic device to seal you in. But luckily for you, there is a note left on the table. It reads, "Dear YouTube subscriber," if you aren't, please subscribe. "This is the police. We will come and save you in exactly 9 months. We are very sorry about this disturbance. We have left a plethora of food in the pantry, and please try your best to at least enjoy yourself." With that, you put the note away and choose to explore. You check the pantry and find far more food than you need to sustain yourself. You feel a sense of comfort, as although you were forced here, you will be okay. So with your newfound free time, you enjoy yourself. You play chess with yourself, find the time to read Freud and Jung, and sleep a lot. As the months pass, the seasons change, you get a tap on the door.
Police department, third floor! Police department, third floor!
You let them in, and they check on you, and see you are in good health after being trapped. They apologize for the inconvenience and release you. One officer gets curious though, and examines the wizard tower, ensuring that nothing was stolen or damaged. However, he opens up the pantry, and an odd smell comes from it. He looks around trying to identify this odd stench, and uncovers a blanket. He takes the blanket off, and shrieks. The officer confronts you in horror. He had found a dead baby. Stop giggling, just say the line.
What is the reason for this? Why is there a dead baby?
You truthfully respond with, "Look, the baby was here when I was locked away. I didn't feel the need to feed it." They eventually charge you with child neglect and manslaughter, although the child was not your own. Did you do something wrong? What I just gave to you was actually a pro-life argument. Why would I do that when I believe in pro-choice? Because I need this analogy in order to properly argue my position. Clearly, you did something wrong by letting that baby die. You allowed the child to starve to death. Although you were not that kid's parent, you are arguably the moral caretaker of that kid, even though you were forced into the situation. You were the only one who could have been responsible for an innocent life that could not protect itself, so you had the duty to protect it. You have a moral duty to. And to further extend this to the analogy of abortion, you were forced into that tower, meaning that this analogy only really works in the case of rape. Let's hypothetically say that you willingly went into the tower and you knew that the kid was in there. In this analogy, which is more common for how people actually get pregnant, you definitely did something wrong. You knew the kid was in the tower, and instead of being captured by Secret Service agents, you willingly served your 9 months. Cool. So I think we can extend this analogy to actual abortions now. What I think this proves is that you shouldn't be able to get an abortion when life becomes valuable. That's because although you were forced into a scenario where you had to care for somebody else, I think that you still have the duty to care for somebody, even though you were forced into that tower. This is because although somebody can be forced into a pregnancy, just as they were forced into the tower, we still have some sort of moral duty to save life, even when it is against our own will. So I think this begs the question, when does life begin? If we can agree that we shouldn't allow abortions when a life is formed, when should we cut this off? I framed the question improperly. Instead of asking when life begins, a far better question is to ask, when is life worth value? The pro-life advocates do in fact get it right when they say that a new life is formed at conception. That is the point in which a new life is formed. But in my opinion, they get it wrong when they proclaim that this is when we should give a fetus personhood. Personhood, arguably, is when life becomes valuable. Are cancer cells unique human life? Well, yeah, they are. They function differently and have unique DNA compared to the host. But are cancer cells worth value? No, they're not. Just because something is a unique human life, that doesn't necessarily mean it is worth value. And this is in fact where the pro-life advocates get their position wrong. So I think this also begs the question, what do we value? To me, it seems that we value the human consciousness more than anything. And it seems to be what makes us human. To highlight this, I have a few arguments to go over. My first question to you is, when do we die? Now, oftentimes a very deep and philosophical question, Scientists seem to give us an answer. We don't die when our heart stops beating, or when our lungs stop pumping air, or when our last cell in our body rots away. We die when our brain ceases to function. This is otherwise known as brain death. No one has come back from brain death. I think this also begs another question. Why is this the point in which we die? We set death at this point because it seems to be that the brain contains what is you. The you being the conscious experience and how you engage with the real world. The inner spirit or the self. It is fundamentally our conscious experience that matters in the material plane. Naturally, if this is the point in which somebody dies, we need to go to the start of that to understand when life or personhood actually begins. This, in my opinion, is the point in which somebody has the ability to deploy consciousness. With that being said, it seems to be that all of the parts are in place around the 20 to 24 week mark. This is when the thalamocortical structure forms. A big word and pretty scary, but it's basically when the thalamus starts sending sensory inputs and motor inputs to the frontal cortex. This is widely considered to be required for consciousness. Now, of course, there are other cutoffs that people have. For example, some argue that consciousness doesn't start until 35 weeks. But I think until more research comes out about this topic, it is probably best to put it at the earliest date that we know consciousness to form in order to prevent murder from taking place.
But wait, Charles, you're missing something, the capacity to deploy consciousness. Are you out of your mind? Won't a fetus eventually gain the capacity to deploy consciousness? Also, you'd have to be unconscious to not subscribe and join the Discord to see more fantastic videos like this one.
Thank you, Tommy. Appreciate it. Well, yes, it will, but that does not mean it has the capacity currently to deploy consciousness. Although a seed may one day grow into a large tree, it does not mean that it will without being planted and given soil, sun, and water. A fetus is that seed. A fetus, prior to 20 weeks, does not have the possibility of deploying consciousness. It fundamentally does not have the parts in place at that current moment to have that experience. In its current state, it is just a fetus. It does not have personhood up until 20 weeks when the consciousness and the bits and pieces in place actually start to form to allow something to deploy that. It now has all the parts in place to experience the world. Prior to 20 weeks, a fetus does not have the parts in place to experience consciousness. The parts of the brain that are required for that to be enabled are simply not there yet. Just because it will, it does not mean it has. Hence, an abortion is permissible up until 20 weeks. And here's another argument to explain why we might value consciousness more than other things. Let's say you, yes you, YouTube subscriber, were to undergo an operation. An evil scientific wizard uses magic to cut off your head and put it on a robot body. He then takes the robotic head left over and places it on your old human body. Now, if I had to ask you, which one of these beings is more you? You'd probably say the one with the human head and the robot body. There aren't two of you now all of a sudden. There is still only one of you. And that one seems to be the one that has the brain intact still. This highlights that we don't value your lungs, your heart, the formation of your toenails, or anything like that. What we truly value is your brain, the consciousness, the inner self, the spirit. All of those things are what we truly value. There are often objections to the consciousness point, and I'll respond to Ben Shapiro's response to this.
Well, so the question is, why should capacity for consciousness be the line, right? Now the burden of proof is on you to show why capacity for consciousness should be the line, particularly because consciousness is more of a sliding scale. I mean, the fact is that, unfortunately, consciousness is not binary. It's not like you're unconscious week 9 and now week 10 you are a fully conscious human being capable of recognizing your surroundings. That obviously is not true. Babies hold consciousness in a different way than older children do, which is why Peter Singer, the philosopher from Princeton, has suggested that infanticide should be okay up to year 3. Right? So the question is, what level of consciousness do you feel is necessary in order to preserve a human life? I think consciousness is kind of a bad argument because, as I've said before, there are times when you are temporarily unconscious, right? I mean, like you are unconscious when you are asleep. This does not deride your value of life. And when you're talking about a baby that is developing in the womb, or a fetus or an embryo developing in the womb, you are talking about temporary unconsciousness because they are in the process of development.
Right.
I have 3 responses to this critique. First, It is hard to say that sleeping or being in a coma is actually an unconscious state. You can still feel stuff in your sleep and interact with the real world still. So I wouldn't go as far as to say that that is an unconscious experience. And in some cases, people in comas can still hear things from the outside world. Secondly, let's grant that both of these are actually unconscious states, just for the sake of the argument. My argument about the pieces being in place would still apply. These people still have the capacity of a self, as those parts of the brain are still there and still functioning, so it would mean that they still are conscious. These people still have the parts in place of creating the self. The connection that I spoke about prior is still there, even if it's not being actively used. Third, it can also be presumed that one self enters this state and then returns from that state. So the one enters and comes out. There is no you yet, there is no consciousness yet when you are a fetus. It only happens at the 20-week mark. So the you that enters that state did not actually exist when you were a fetus. Therefore, this argument doesn't really make much sense. Speaking of making no sense, many conservatives also say that the heartbeat or viability are imperfect cutoffs for abortion. And I would 100% agree, actually. These cutoffs make no sense for abortion. If our cutoff is heartbeat, there are still people who have pacemakers in order to stay alive. Should we kill them? Doesn't seem like a good idea to me. It also just really isn't a good cutoff for when personhood again, and it often would lead to mothers not actually being able to get an abortion because heartbeat forms around 6 weeks. The same thing applies to viability. I think that viability is an improper cutoff because there are still people who are alive who are dependent upon others. So hence, if our cutoff was viability, we would have to permit killing some other people that we really shouldn't be killing. And of course, it wouldn't be an abortion video if I didn't cover the violinist argument. Judith Thompson explained this argument in her fantastic abortion paper. In her paper, she proposes a world-famous violinist falling into a coma. For some reason, you and him have a very similar DNA match. So one night in your sleep, you wake up beside him in a hospital with tubes connecting you two together. The doctor informs you that your nutrients from your body is being used to sustain his life, and that if you stay there for 9 months, he will be returned to full health. However, they also inform you that you can pull the plug whenever you like, but if you pull the plug at any point before 9 months, he will die. What do you do? First, this argument only really works in the case of rape, due to the fact that you are forced into this scenario, so it wouldn't really apply to most abortions. Furthermore, I do in fact think that your moral duties arguably force you to stay for 9 months. You give up 9 months of your life in order to save an entire person's lifetime. I think that seems like a pretty fair trade. If I were to change the optics of this scenario, and let's say instead of a violinist, it were your own child, do you feel differently about it? I would think that most people do. And that might be more similar to an actual abortion. However, I do have one exception to my law, and that is of course when the life of the mother is at risk. Even the most pro-life people agree with this exception. I don't really think that we should have an exception for incest or rape. For me, it matters when life is valuable, which of course I think is the point in which consciousness forms. So similar to the tower analogy, in the case of rape, although you were forced in that scenario, it seems immoral still to get an abortion. Incest also seems like borderline eugenics, as people who are born of incest are more likely to have abnormalities. So it seems like we're trying to justify some sort of eugenics when it comes to this. Also, my view is actually really inclusive for this because you still have the opportunity to get an abortion before 20 weeks. So people who are victims of rape and incest can still get that abortion done. It is not as crazy as life beginning at conception. There still is opportunities for people who are forced into bad scenarios to get that procedure done. The last subject I'd like to touch on is Roe v. Wade. This was the case that made abortion legal law of the land. Unfortunately, it was bound to get shot down eventually. One court case can't set the precedent for something as important as abortion. It is literally a question of when personhood begins. Unfortunately, though, the Supreme Court shot it back down to the states, which makes no sense to me whatsoever. It makes no sense to me that life starts at conception in one state, but then starts at a different point in another state. That doesn't really connect whatsoever to me. So here is my national abortion law or amendment. Also, unfortunately, the national government might not have the authority to actually craft an abortion law, but they certainly have the authority to craft an abortion amendment. So here is my national abortion amendment or possibly law.
Those shall be allowed to have an abortion up until 20 weeks into the pregnancy, which is believed to be the point in which consciousness forms. One may receive one at any point during a pregnancy if one can reasonably believe that their life was at risk. Yeah.
Thank you, Thomas.
I was able to
Big
read
man.
3 paragraphs correctly.
There we go. Now call up your local lawmaker and get him to push this in Congress. Also important to highlight, I don't really agree with the my body, my choice talking point. I think it would give justification for terminating a baby at 9 months. Like, does the baby cease being in your body at 9 months? No, it doesn't. So although I called my argument pro-choice just to get more clicks, my argument is ultimately more pro-abortion or pro-consciousness. It would probably be better described as that. The end. Thank you for watching. If you haven't already, I'd appreciate if you would join my Discord, follow my Instagram, Twitter, and Twitch, and subscribe, like, comment, and do everything you can. Share it with your friends. Thank you for watching. Pellin out.